the screen is visible now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Now, last week we have ended with the enumeration of the 6 accomplishments or attainments or qualities or qualifications that are required to tread the spiritual path. The first one is Shama. See, as I mentioned in the last week session also, this is all in the form of question and answer, and most of the time the answers are very short or very crisp. It actually means that we need to do a lot of contemplation on this. Just not go by the word meaning, but do a lot of contemplation as to what exactly it means. While, as I said, for a preliminary purpose, it is okay for a mental understanding, but that would not be sufficient. And sometimes what happens is there is a possibility of misunderstanding the statement also. Because unfortunately, we are dealing in a language different from the original, what is originally given in the Sanskrit language. So when it is translated, the impact of the original cannot be conveyed into the translation, and the translation itself has a limitation. So we start with the statement, Shamaha Kaha. Mano Nigraha is the answer. What is Shama? Control or mastery over the mind is the answer. Now, while the dictionary meaning of the term Nigraha, the etymological meaning of the word means control, restraint, suppression, or holding it down. All these meanings are there, but they do not strictly apply in this particular case. Because you see, what happens in all these cases is, it is not a question of putting it down by force or controlling it and somehow restraining it. That actually indicates a duality of our own mind. That means one part of our mind is saying to the other part of the mind that I should control, I should master. But it is the mind which has to be controlled, or it is the mind itself which has to be dealt with in totality. In a holistic manner, the mind has to be dealt with. You can't divide the mind into two and one part of the mind saying to the other part that I should control, I should master, or I should overcome, or I should restrain, or all these things are, very superficial, and sometimes they appear to be very misleading. Misleading in the sense, how can one part of the mind dictate to the other part to control? Because this is a subjective matter, and the only instrument available to us is the mind. And the mind has to deal with the mind. The problem is that I have to deal with myself. So I have to use the mind and deal with the mind, and progressively, or in a fashion, in a manner, bring about a qualitative change, whereby it is easy to transcend it, or it is easy to use for the purpose for which it is meant. See, it is more actually a case of understanding the very nature of the mind. You have to understand what is the nature of the mind. The nature of the mind is dualistic. The nature of the mind is acquisitive, accumulative. The nature of the mind is analytical. And when it wants to analyze something, it will break it down into pieces. It will deliberately try to fragment it, make it into fragments, and try to understand each piece of it, because it cannot understand the whole thing at one shot. And in fact, Ramana Maharshi used to say that don't suppress it. This suppression, what happens is the mind will spring back. The mind will act like a spring. When you what happens when you put a lot of pressure on the spring, all that pressure is pent up or built up into the coils of the spring, and at the earliest opportunity it will rebound. It will bounce back with actually sometimes double the force. It will bounce back with double the force. So the question of controlling or mastering or restraining it or suppressing it is not the actual intention here. Though the translation or the original in some forms may appear to be that, the intention is not that. It is primarily, if you are trying to understand the nature of the mind, one thing that should be very, very clear to all of us is that it is directed outward. It is always directed outward. That is why the mind is also called as one of the senses only. It is called as the sixth sense, because like all our senses, they are directed outwards and they expect inputs from the outside for its functioning. So the primary aspect of Shama is turning it inwards. We have to turn the mind inwards and examine itself. That is the fundamental process which has to be understood. Otherwise, it is very easy to project it outward, because it has been used for that purpose for decades, right from our birth. It has been used for that purpose. Outward flowing, outward looking. It doesn't have the training or ability to look inwards. So you see, when you turn it inwards, you will be able to examine how the mind is agitated, how the mind is disturbed, how the mind is wandering, how the mind is fickle and jumps from one aspect to another aspect, one topic to another topic, one subject to another subject. See, in our Sanatana Dharma and the ancient scriptures, the mind has been compared to a monkey, like jumping from one branch to another, from here to there. The monkey is never steady, it's never constant, doesn't sit quietly anywhere. So that is one aspect of it. And traditionally, the esoteric aspect of the scripture says that the moon is the ruling lord of the mind, is the Adhidevata or Devata of the mind, the moon. We'll come to it later, because that also is mentioned in some of these statements. Why it is compared is because moon is the one which has got this tendency of phases. From new moon to full moon, it grows. Again, from full moon to new moon, it wanes. So this waxing and waning of moon is the essential quality of the mind also. And in fact, if you examine some of these words, like lunar means something connected with the moon. And the waxing of the and waning of the moon has a tremendous impact on the mind. Just as it has a great impact on the ebbs and tides of the sea. When on a full moon day, if you see the waves are much higher. So a moon which is a few lakhs kilometers away can impact a vast ocean to behave in a peculiar manner, whereby there is a rise of the tides and the waves of the ocean. That is the reason why a person who is mentally disturbed is called a lunatic. That also comes from the word lunar, because it is the moon that disturbs the person and the mind gets disturbed because of the moon. So fundamentally, when you start looking inwards, you will be able to observe the nature of the mind, how fickle it is, how it is jumping from one subject to another, one topic to another, and then going on in a state of agitation. So when they say mano nigraha, the aspect to be recognized is that it has to be calm and unruffled. The mind has to be in a state which is calm and unruffled. In fact, when you encounter some difficult situation or a difficult person, one gets irritable. He says, I can't stand that fellow, I can't stand that person or that issue. The mind has a serious impact on the nervous system of the human body. So that's why the statement, he gets onto my nerves. When you say he gets onto my nerves, means I am disturbed. I become irritable. See, this has to be very carefully understood, in the sense, on one side, you have to examine the mind carefully and see that it is calm and unruffled. On the other side, you should make it sensitive. If you make it sensitive, there is this possibility of being easily disturbed by any sound or any minor disturbance also from outside can cause a great disturbance in the mind. So these appear to be mutually contradictory, but that is the training with which we are concerned. On one side, whatever may be the external stimulus, I should remain calm and unruffled. And on the other side, I should make it sensitive enough to vibrate to different frequencies. I'm not rejecting some frequencies and accepting some frequencies. I should be sensitive to all the frequencies, but at the same time, I should remain unruffled. So this is one more aspect which we have to see. Then, Shama also connotes development of a quality called as courage. How is courage relevant here? Because you need lot of inner strength to face all the trials and tribulations and difficulties in life. So it requires great mental strength, great inner strength, which is described, or which is mentioned as the quality of courage. Then again, as I mentioned earlier, is the quality of steadiness. See, mind is also, always in a state where it is incessantly worries about small things, little things. In fact, as we grow old, I think we become much more touchy and much more worrisome. We worry about everything, every small matter. We want our things in a particular fashion. We want our, our house or our room or something to be in a particular fashion only. We become very fastidious about things. and we unnecessarily worry about maybe our children or grandchildren or somebody or something close to you. Something happens. Yes, some grandchild has a cold or cough or fever. It becomes a matter of great worry. It may appear to be as a genuine concern or genuine love, but that can be expressed, or that aspect can be there without allowing the mind to be ruffled or disturbed or worried. It's a very, fine line which one has to tread. So courage is one aspect, and steadiness is one aspect. And generally what happens is, whether one likes it or not, there are several things from the outside which impact us, on which we have no control. So nothing from outside, such as sorrows or troubles or sicknesses or losses, should affect the calmness of the mind. It should not affect the quietude of the mind. Otherwise, what happens is, obviously, when we are growing old, we see people dying, we see people becoming sick, and our own experiences are such that we may be put to great loss, financial or otherwise, or is great amount of suffering, or we ourselves may be sick. As you progress from the point of view of age, you may have some ailments. Some of them may be chronic, some of them may be acute, some of them you have to learn to live with. So all these things also should be perceived, and see whether one can remain without being disturbed by all of these factors. So nothing from outside should be disturbing. Another aspect that is normally mentioned is, when we go through life, sorrow, suffering, sickness, loss, troubles, tribulations, all these things are quite common to everybody. They may vary in degree, they may vary in intensity, they may vary in frequency, they may vary in other aspects, but the common ground is that everybody goes through these things. Now, understand is that a great part of our karma is being played out. A great part of our karma may be getting exhausted through these sufferings and sorrow and losses and illness and so on and so forth. So in one way, we should be able to understand it at a deeper level and appreciate that there is a diminishing of karma. But it is very difficult. When we are actually in sorrow, when we are actually suffering, we blame everybody around us, we blame everything around us, except ourselves, and recognize the fact that it could be my own karma which I am exhausting. Because there is an occult maxim. Occult means something which is esoteric. There is an esoteric statement which says, all evil is transitory. This is one statement one should ponder over deeply and understand the significance of it. These are occult statements. That means statements which are made in the Gupta Vidya, in the secret sciences or the esoteric sciences of philosophy or of spirituality, which says that all evil is transitory. The evil you see in yourself, the evil you see in people around you, the evil you see in people who are close to you, all this is transitory. What prevails in the world is goodness. what actually prevails on a regular basis, on a continuous basis, and also from the ultimate point of view, is that triple aspect of manifestation of Satyam, Shivam, Sundaram. Truth, goodness, and beauty. Only these three things will prevail in manifestation forever. Everything else is transitory, especially evil. So this statement has to be understood at a deeper level. And if you understand that, one can develop an attitude of remaining always in a state of joy and serenity. In a state of joy and serenity, one can remain. Provided you understand the nature of the mind, nature of the manifestation, nature of evil. Once you have a deeper understanding of it, all these things become apparent. And one of the biggest danger, and in fact today the biggest problem in almost all the developed countries, and it is spreading to other developing and underdeveloped countries also, is this psychological illness or disease called as depression. Especially during this lockdown, there's so much of discussion that people are getting depressed. We don't know what for they are getting depressed, but they are getting depressed because the mind is unable to cope with the changed circumstances, changed situations. There is an unprecedented and drastic change which has happened in a short period of time. So when the mind is unable to cope with it, it goes into depression. So one of the aspects of mano nigraha or shama is never to allow oneself to feel sad or depressed. Because depression not only affects the person who is depressed, but it affects everybody around. So if there is a patient of depression in a particular home, all the family members are also affected by it. There is lot of unease, there is lot of anxiety, there is lot of tension in such a house. In such a place where one person is depressed, all the others become tense, all the others become wary, because they do not know how this person who is depressed will behave. He may sometimes lock himself up in the room and not respond at all. Or he may suddenly get a bout of anger, or he may throw tantrums, and he may suddenly turn violent for some time. So you see, this depression is something which is not only affecting the person himself, but everybody around. Actually, it should be the other way around. Wherever one goes, one should be in a position to spread peace and joy and serenity. Instead of that, if one is spreading depression and being morose and sad and gloomy and melancholic, then what happens? The whole atmosphere gets vitiated. The whole atmosphere becomes a problem. So this also is implied in this shama. Then there is another aspect which is very important. What is called as pride or arrogance? The mind has got this tendency of becoming arrogant. You know, it feels a sort of uniqueness and a sort of pride in itself, and thinks that it is doing things. I have great ability to do this, I have great ability to do that, and I am unique in so and so respect. I have these special qualities. Precisely for this purpose, another important statement in esoteric philosophy is that pride comes only from ignorance. The source of all pride is ignorance. It is that foolishness, that stupidity of the mind, that ignorance of the mind, which it feels that it is doing things and it alone is doing things, and all its achievements are personal, all its capabilities are something self-acquired. Even if some of these things may be true, maybe you are unique, maybe you have great abilities in a particular direction, but there is no scope for pride because it will not remain as such. It will give rise to arrogance. And arrogance, the moment people around you see that you are arrogant, they distance themselves from you. There is no friendship. There is no oneness. There is no sense of belonging. There is that sense of superiority in you, which people feel bad about it. And you lose control on account of your arrogance, on your words, on your actions, on your gestures, on your thinking. Now, do we see how many aspects are covered in this Shama? I'll just enumerate them once again. Quietude and unruffled state of mind. Courage, steadiness, joy and serenity, not being in a state of sadness and depression, and pride. And the greatest problem with the mind, if one is able to observe, is its propensity to wander. Its mind has this great propensity to wander, to go here and there. And that is why it is said, mind will be anywhere but here and in any time but now. The now and here is the biggest problem or challenge for the mind. It wanders. It simply goes on a trip. Uncharted courses. It doesn't know where it is going. It will simply go wherever it wants to go. It is never now and here. In that sense, this aspect of control or mastery comes into picture. Every time it is wandering, you may have to bring it back to the subject. Every time it's going somewhere, you have to bring it back. You have to bring it back to the present. You have to bring it back to the now. All these things have to be observed very carefully. And all this is a part of Shama. So there is so much in this small reply. Shamaha kaha mano nigraha. What is Shama? Shama is control or mastery over the mind. But if you hold on to these few words only, then one is lost. One is lost in the process if it is holding on to only the statement. A deep contemplation should reveal all the facets which I have discovered, which I have discussed just now. So we have to, primarily, two things have to be done. All the rest have to be progressively observed and eliminated. Primarily, first is, as I mentioned, turning it inwards. Number one. Number two, observe how it is wandering all over the place. The moment you observe, slowly that wandering will come down. And slowly, the frequency and speed of thoughts will also come down. The number of thoughts and the speed at which the thoughts are coming will also slow down considerably. So these are the two major issues. A mind which has been, trained, or which got used to always being directed outwards, you have to take a U-turn and make it inwards. And the second aspect is one has to observe how this is wandering. Well, when you observe it without interference, then what happens is the frequency or the number of thoughts and the speed at which these thoughts are moving will also come down, and slowly one is able to understand the true nature of the mind and come into that calm and unruffled state. This is what is implied in this whole exercise of acquisition of this quality or qualification called as Shama. This is Shama. I think we have discussed this Shama enough, and a lot of material is available for us to, ponder over, to contemplate and understand at a deeper level. Then we will go to the other one called as Dhamma. Dhammaha kaha chakshuradi bahyendriya nigraha. What is Dhamma?
Krishnapani sir, I have sent two questions to you. You see whether it should be taken up now or later.
Maybe okay, no problem. I can take it up now also. Because we will be able to complete the aspect of what do we call as I'm just searching for the chat. I think I have to minimize the screen sharing part of it, or stop the screen sharing for the time being and go to the chat. Yeah. One is from, I think, Commodore Sarangi. Can we say Shama is controlling our inputs through our sensory organs? And the other one is, pride and arrogance can be due to vasanas to be overcome. Depression and dementia may be a result of karma. Sir, I'll just take up the one earlier. Can we say Shama is controlling our inputs through our sensory organs? No, sir. It's not exactly controlling the inputs. The mind itself has sufficient inputs to create enough amount of problem. You need not, because when you talk about controlling of inputs, you have to start somewhere now. Stopping or controlling the inputs now has no meaning, because enough has already been allowed. See, to use the modern, the latest vocabulary that is in vogue, see, after you have allowed a million people to come in, then you impose quarantine or containment will not help. You have already allowed 1 million people into the city. Now, by closing the other avenues, you may only stop more from coming in. But how do you deal with the 1 million people who have already entered? So, it is not about controlling our inputs through the sense organs. It is actually observing the nature of the mind. The nature of the mind, as I mentioned, is it is partial, it is fragmentary, it is limited, it is divisive, it is analytical, it is wandering, it is jumping from one subject to another subject. It behaves in a very erratic manner left to its own machinations. Left to itself, it will behave in a very erratic manner. So that whole process has to be observed. That whole process of the erratic nature of the mind, the wandering nature of the mind, the fragmentary nature of the mind, the limited processing and analysis that goes on in the mind, the doubts and difficulties that come into the mind, its ability to not to its inability to understand deeper aspects of life. All these things are a part of the mind. So we are actually dealing with things inward. That's why when you direct your whole flow of consciousness inwards into the mind itself, then by observation without interference, the mind will reveal itself what kind of mischief it has been playing and what kind of mischief it is capable of playing. It will also reveal to you that it can deceive itself in a million ways. Unless one is brutally honest with oneself, we find that we justify everything. Anything which I do, I will justify. If the same thing is done by somebody else, I will condemn you. This is the nature of the mind. This is the whole problem. So all this has to be understood. That is the way to go about. Otherwise, as I said, the mind is also capable of deceiving itself by dividing into two, and one mind saying to the other part of the mind that I should control it, or I should overcome it, or I should become spiritual, I should become more evolved, I should become transcendent. It can create all the, because it is still within the field of the mind only that this mischief is happening. All this has to be observed. And this is possible only when you are living your life fully. How do I confront a challenge? How do I deal with a problem in my life? Like sorrow or suffering or death or loss or what do you call as sickness or illness or serious problems. How do I deal with it? See, I have known a few people and I have advised them also, please don't do this, because what happens is there are so many of us who have a tendency to immediately start off tangentially to some other direction. Like if I become sick, I am not concerned more about my sickness. I go on lamenting, why did it come to me? Why did it happen to me? I am like anybody else, or the so-and-so has got the same habits like me, but he is able to enjoy and he doesn't have the problem I have. No, this is a ridiculous way of looking at it, isn't it? See, I know some people, non-smokers who have got lung cancer. They never smoked in their life, but they had lung cancer. And there are people who have been smoking for the past 50 years and they are hale and hearty. Now, I can't cry and say, I never smoked in my life, I never did that, I never did this, I've always been very good and I've had very good habits and all. Why am I suffering from this cancer? Why that fellow who has been smoking for the past 50 years is not suffering? That's a ridiculous way of looking at things. Each one has to see, we don't know what are our weak points, where the constitution is weak, how I am suffering in this process. All these things are individual. And that is where we come to the second aspect, as the other questions of Janaki Ramji. Janaki Ramji has sent me 2 questions privately and saying, pride and arrogance can be due to vasanas to be overcome. Depression and dementia may be the result of karma. Yeah, see, that is precisely what one of the texts says. If you read At the Feet of the Master, in that very clearly it is said that one has to remain joyous and serene in all states, irrespective of how things are happening or what is happening to one. Because this arrogance or pride, as Janaki Ramji says, is something which could be a vasana. We have been like that for lives together. But it's not right to really blame it on the past lives and all, because it was our own life, and it's a continuity. It is important to deal with it in this particular life, now and here. Similarly, depression and dementia could be also a consequence of some of the bad karma, and it is getting exhausted. I mentioned that also, where there is an exhaustion of it. But Janaki Ramji, please understand that calling them as vasanas or karma is only an explanation. We are trying to explain it. What we are more concerned is, how do you deal with it? How do you deal with in this life? How do we tackle when we are in that situation? Do we recognize that I have this great amount of arrogance in me? See, in order to deal with arrogance, one has to accept that one has arrogance in oneself. If I deny it simply that I am not arrogant, so there is no point, or there is no question of dealing with it all. So it requires a great amount of observation and a great amount of humility and a great amount of facing the truth. That courage to face the truth. That courage to face the truth, whereby you are recognizing, one is recognizing the fact that one has arrogance in oneself. Then it becomes easy to deal with it. Similarly, with depression and dementia also, some serious illnesses of the body and the mind could be karmic, could be linked to karma. But in spite of the working out of the karma, one can exercise will not to be depressed, whatever be the situation. Again, this is a factor where one has to recognize that one is depressed. Most of the patients of depression don't acknowledge that they are depressed. They don't agree. If somebody points out to them also, they don't agree. If you take them to a psychiatrist or a psychologist also, they will simply deny, no, I am not depressed. All these people around me behave in such a manner that I am forced to respond in this manner. That is a problem. See, then Commodore Sarangi ji says, my question was like jumping in, sensory organs related to Dhamma. Yes, Shama is okay, right. It is a second aspect, sir. When we are dealing with Dhamma, we'll come to it. There's a question by Ms. Sania. How do we deal with depression? Would you kindly explain what are some of the ways? See, these are not, see, I am neither a psychiatrist nor a psychologist nor an expert on depression in any way, madam. Please understand that what I am trying to explain is from a common sense point of view and from a spiritual point of view. The common sense point of view to deal with is to accept reality. The biggest challenge for a for somebody suffering from depression is his or her inability to accept the reality. Number one. The second aspect is that a person in depression considers that it is outside sources that are causing the depression, and that he is the only person who is suffering to a very great extent. He thinks that all the troubles in the world are dumped on his head, his or her head. To overcome that, if we can observe the lives of people around us, in order to understand that how lucky we are, how fortunate we are that we are able to attend this webinar. Not because of what is being said in the webinar, but the mere fact that we have a computer or a laptop or a smartphone, and we have an internet connection, and we have leisure, and we have food on our table, and we have a place to rest and sleep, and a good home. See, all these things, there are millions and millions of people who are deprived of these basic necessities. These basic necessities are deprived for millions and millions of people. It is estimated that almost 25% of the global population sleeps hungry in the night. In 24 hours, if they get one reasonably good meal, they are very lucky. So, who are we to complain about anything? How can one be in a state of depression when one is not deprived of anything which millions and millions of people are deprived? So from a very common sense point of view also, if we enlarge our vision, if we widen the scope of our observation of the vastness of life, we will see that there are millions and millions of people who are suffering tremendously and are deprived of the very basic necessities of life. And from a spiritual point of view, depression is such a dangerous condition where you completely vitiate the entire environment around you. You create a gloomy environment, you will attract all negative energies, your bodily energy will get sapped, you will feel drained out, you don't feel like doing anything, you don't feel like participating in anything. This is the attraction of the negative energy. This is the great attraction of the negative energy. And from a spiritual point of view, it will pull down one to a very great depth from which it becomes difficult to come back. So, a spiritually evolved person who understands the nature of the mind, Binaji, this is in response to what you mentioned. See, one can be positive through one's own willpower. In the worst of the situations also, one can be positive and exercise one's own willpower, whereby you can counter the depressed surroundings, the depleted energy levels, the negative energies can be countered by you. Now, that is the reason why sometimes they say that you go to holy places, you go to sacred places, you go to a temple, or you go to some other place, an ashram, where positive vibrations are there, where positive people come together. That is the reason, that is the necessity of this satsang also. The reason why we all gather together as in a satsang is precisely this. We will, for the time being, for 1 hour or 1.5 hours, let us completely keep all our problems aside and actively participate in this activity. When one comes into this atmosphere, there is this possibility of driving away these negative energies and keeping these negative energies at bay. And progressively, as you do it, you will gather positive energy around you and you will come out of that depression. So, you see, karma is not something inexorable and already fixed. Only some part of the karma is fixed. Major part of the karma is in a fluid state where it is getting exhausted and replenished and exhausted. So we are creating a turmoil in the whole what do you call as the pool of karma. If I have a certain pool of karma, I am taking out some of it and putting out something in it, and there is a dynamic aspect to this karma. The static aspect of karma is, say, somebody who is born blind, somebody who is born lame, somebody has got he is dumb or deaf. That is the given karma of it. That nobody can really change. Still human being is such a wonderful creature. If somebody is born blind, they can examine and see whether the nervous system is okay and whether some eye transplantation can be done and vision can be given to them. Or somebody who is deaf and dumb, some minor operation can bring back their voice or their hearing capacity. So human being has always been that innovative and dealing with these things also. So karma is basically not something given or static. It's a dynamic flow within the pool of one's own life's accumulation, and it is not independent also. It is actually, that is why it is referred to as a web of karma. Our karma is very much intermingled with the whole of the world. So that is the way one has to perceive things. I think we have dwelt on this subject for quite some time. Shall we go to the next one of Dhamma? Dhammaha kaha. Now, the second one, I'll stop after another 10 minutes or so that we can have time for questions. The next is, the next of the Shat Sampatti is Dhamma. Dhammaha kaha chakshuradi bahyendriya nigrahaha. What is Dhamma? Control or mastery over external sense organs. Why they are called as external? Because their normal direction of functioning is external. Chakshu means the eyes. Adi means etc. Tvak, Chakshu, Shrotra, Ghrana, Rasanendriyas. These are the 5 Jnanendriyas, or organs for acquisition of inputs or knowledge. Jnanendriyas. Indriyas meant for acquiring jnana or knowledge, and they are all bahya, that means external. These 5: Tvak, Chakshu, Shrotra, Ghrana, and Rasana. Tvak is the skin, Chakshu is the eyes, Shrotra is the ears, Ghrana is the sense of smell, Rasana is the sense of taste. Now, here again, we have to see some finer dimensions of it. One important factor to be recognized is, why is Shama given first as the number 1 of the Shat Sampatti and Dhamma as the number 2? We have to see this, why this is sequenced this way. Normally, we may think that controlling our external organs we should start with our external organs. It is easy to close our eyes or close our ears or close our mouth, isn't it? So it should be Dhamma first and then Shama? No. See, the mind is the one which controls these senses. It is the sensory aspect of feeling or touch or taste or smell or sight. The actual nerve centers are in the brain, and the brain is the instrument of the mind. Brain is the instrument of the mind, and the nerve centers connected with these five senses are situated in the brain. So, if you have understood Shama properly, it is very, very clear that a person who has attained a certain level of mastery of Shama, for him Dhamma becomes very easy. Dhamma becomes very easy for a person who has acquired a certain level of control or mastery over Shama or the mind. If one has sufficiently practiced Shama, when I say practice, it is not some kind of training. It is this aspect of observation, keenly observing, paying great amount of attention, great amount of perception without interference. That is the meaning of practice. It doesn't mean that you go on training it like a muscle. No. Observation is the process involved to understand the nature of the mind. So one who has understood the nature of the mind will also understand how these external sense organs can play mischief. And therefore it becomes easy. And there is a positive aspect to this control also, control or mastery over external senses. First of all, one cannot remain without doing any action. Yes? One cannot remain in a state of total inaction. That is what the Bhagavad Gita also says. Even Sri Krishna says, when I have taken an avatara, I have also to participate in activity here. So similarly, the positive aspect of Dhamma is your controlled thought, your mastery over your thought should result in the performance of good actions. Because you cannot remain without action. Because you cannot remain without action, what kind of actions will you do? You will do good actions. You will do good actions. You will continue to perform good actions. That is a positive way of controlling. That is a very positive way of controlling. You understand the nature of this? So, thereby, you are overcoming a tamasic tendency of laziness. Good action means you are overcoming this tamasic nature of laziness, indolence, lethargy, both of the mind and the body. Then the question comes as to what kind of action or what type of action one should do. In order to do good action, one should understand that one has to perform one's own duty, one's own dharma. One has to perform one's own dharma. I should not perform somebody else's dharma out of my overaction and our tendency to do good action. One should not do actions which are not meant for us to do, and actions which we are not supposed to overdo. We used to have a gentleman called John B.S. Coates, who was one of the former international presidents of the Theosophical Society. He used to narrate a joke. You know, the scouts are there, Boy Scouts. So the leader of that Boy Scouts in a school, the teacher, who was head of that Scouts activity, has told them to do one good deed every day. So he has told them. The next day he asks, "Okay, John, what good deed did you do today?" Then that boy stands up and says, "Sir, I helped an old lady to cross the road today." They said, "Wonderful, John. Okay, now Bob, what did you do?" Then Bob says, "Sir, I helped John to help the lady to cross the road." Then the master thinks, okay, maybe she was quite old and both of them had to hold both her hands and cross the road. Then he comes to the third fellow and says, "What did you do?" Then the third fellow says, "I helped John and Bob to help that lady to cross the road." Then this fellow says, my, that's too much. You know, one fellow helping, okay, two also is okay. But what was the necessity of you helping those two fellows to cross that, for the old lady to cross the road? Then that fellow gets up and confesses, "Sir, the whole problem is the lady did not want to cross the road." You see the problem now? Somebody told them that to help an old lady to cross the road is a good deed. So all the three fellows forcibly were taking the lady from this side to the that side, even though she didn't want to cross the road. This is the overaction we do. This is the problem with us. So one should not become a busybody and interfere in everybody's affairs in doing good deeds. So here is the necessity for understanding what is the good action and what is one's own duty. Shreyan swadharmo vigunaha paradharmat swanushthitat. Swadharme nidhanam shreyah paradharmo bhayavaha. This is a verse in the Bhagavad Gita which says, it is better to do one's own duty, though imperfectly, than doing somebody's work perfectly. It is better to die while doing one's own dharma, because paradharma, somebody's dharma, is very dangerous and very fearsome. It is not your duty. So one has to recognize the capacity of one's own body, one's own senses, one's own mind, and so on, to understand what is good action. What is good action is something which has to be very deeply understood. And very interestingly, the third qualification in this is Uparama, which is very wonderfully, defined here. Uparamaha kaha swadharmanushtanameva. I'll not go into this now because we don't have much time. I will stop here and link it to that swadharma which is mentioned in Uparama or Uparati, the third qualification. But one has to very clearly understand the nature of the senses senses by themselves do not create craving. It is the mind that creates the craving. It is the mind that wants more and more of it. So therefore, mastery over the mind is primary. Shama is more important, which has to be followed by Dhamma. The senses themselves do not create any problem, but controlling the senses in this means that one has to perform good actions, one has to be useful to mankind, one has to overcome laziness, one has to understand what is one's duty and continue to perform that duty. As you go on performing your duty, a higher and higher dimension of one's own swadharma, one's own duty will be revealed. Like for instance, suppose somebody has an employee. We are employing somebody, and if that fellow does his work very efficiently, what do? We give him more responsibility. We give him a promotion. We give him an incentive. Similarly, from a spiritual point of view also, if one is performing one's own duty very well, one is performing one's own duty without laziness, without indolence, without lethargy, and very conscientiously, then what happens is a higher dimension of one's own duty is revealed. Then you will be given a higher assignment from a spiritual perspective, and you will be able to perform those duties. That is how one progresses. And it is important to note two things. See, doing one's own duty or performing some kind of service does not mean looking towards doing something great in this world. Very ordinary things, worldly duties have also to be attended to very carefully. Even our daily actions should be performed with a sense of perfection, with a sense of grace, with a sense of beauty. There are some people who do it. Even if somebody is laying a dining table, they do it so beautifully. Everything is proper. Everything is properly placed. Nothing is missing. They take care of it carefully. Somebody is dressing. Somebody is wearing a dress. It has to have its own style, and it should not be shoddy. It should not be careless. And just say that, no, I don't care about my dress, I don't care about my body. No, that's all not acceptable from a spiritual point of view also. So all this is related to action of the senses. The Bahyendriyas, here we can include all the Karmendriyas also. Not only the Jnanendriyas, but the Karmendriyas also are included when they say Indriyas. Our speech, our movement of hands or performance of action by hands and feet. So all Indriyas, all externally oriented senses, whether organs of action or organs of senses, all have to be in a very systematic and controlled manner. And again, that comes only with the control of the mind. The senses cannot have exercise control over themselves directly. It is the mind that drives the senses. It is the mind which holds the reins of these senses, as the Kathopanishad says. Atmanam Rathinam Vidhi. The Atma is the owner of the chariot. The mind is the driver. The horses are like the senses. The reins you hold, they are held by the senses are held in control by the mind. There's a very famous mantra from the Kathopanishad. So this is what is, all these things are implied in this simple statement as a reply to the question Damaha Kaha. What is Dama? Chakshuradi Bahyendriya Nigraha, control or mastery over external sense organs, implies all these things. And I think we are able to appreciate the sequence of it also. The sequence from Shama to Dama. We'll stop here and we have another 12 minutes to go. We can take up some questions for discussion. There are 2 chats are appearing here. Commodore Sarangi says, grateful to you, Krishna, for explaining the difference between Shama and Dama. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Then another gentleman says, Sirji, if one attains the state of Adhikari, as you explained in full measure, then what is more left to achieve? Even if there is any, then it becomes a breeze, including enlightenment. You see, as it is normally said, when you are adequately prepared, you need not do anything else actually. Because the esoteric science, whether the Upanishads or the Bhagavad Gita, very clearly says that the only purpose of jnana is removal of ignorance. The only purpose of all our study is removal of ignorance. You need not separately invite enlightenment or moksha or liberation or freedom or whatever you call it. The truth or ultimate reality or supreme intelligence or whatever may be the term. The fundamental aspect is you have to remove this veil of ignorance. That is the purpose of jnana. Karma is for Atma Shuddhi. Atma Shuddhi is for jnana. Jnana is for removing the veil of ajnana. Because moksha or liberation or enlightenment or freedom is not a thing, is not an object to be attained, is not an object to be grasped. It is nothing, it is totally non-material at whatever level of manifestation we are talking. And jnana is not a product or a result of our action. The ultimate reality or moksha is not a product or a result of our action. You have to understand this. It is there. It is unconnected with anything. It is untouched by anything. We know. It is there. This is the fundamental doctrine of Advaita Vedanta expounded by Adi Shankara even in the Bhagavad Gita. I have that reference also. I can draw that reference and show you. I don't remember it immediately, but very clearly he says that moksha is not an effect or a result or a product of one's own action. No action can bring it into existence. No action can wipe it out from existence. It is there. It is Sat. It is ever present. So what is left is actually, as you have rightly said, sir, there is nothing left for us to do further. Only thing is we are removing the obstacles. We are removing the darkness. The removal of darkness and the bringing forth of illumination are not two separate actions. Once you open the doors and windows, light and fresh air will automatically come in. The obstacle is that we are sitting in a closed, dark room, not aware of the fact that there are doors and windows which have to be opened and that these walls have to be demolished. We don't know that. We are thinking that these walls are for our safety. These walls are protecting us. That is the ignorance. The ignorance is to think that these walls are protecting us. Actually, they are not protecting you. They are great obstacles which are hindering you to see the light and the fresh air that is there outside in abundance. Your opening of the door is not bringing into existence the light or the air. The light or the air is already there. It is already there. So it is neither a product nor a cause nor an effect nor a result of our action. You cannot say that I have realized moksha or I have realized enlightenment. The I is the obstacle. The absence of the I, the complete demolition of this I itself is moksha. Just as I keep mentioning this statement by Professor Ravi Ravindra, he says, it is not the liberation of the self. It is liberation from the self. The self is the problem. You have to be free of that self, free of this I. Therefore, it is there as an enlightenment. It is not that as though I am bringing into existence the whole thing. What we call as moksha or liberation or things like that. There's one more chat. Thanks, Sergi, for an enlightening session. Anchalji, thank you so much. Thank you for your warm words, kind words. Yeah, we have another 5 or 6 minutes to go.
Yeah. Any more questions?
Yes, please. Yeah, any more questions, please?
Yeah. Krishnapani ji, I was just going to ask you, because we start after Shat Sampati, we've done 2 now, and there are 4 left. So do you think we should just, the next session, continue with this so that we can just complete this?
Yeah, if everybody agrees, if everybody is okay, because instead of shifting to another subject of Jiddu Krishnamurti.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. We can just complete this. So if you can just kind of don't unmute yourselves, but just raise your hand and I can get an idea of whoever's keen on doing it. Okay.
Continuing to do with.
We'll continue with, yeah. I can't see too many people because a lot of people have put their videos off. But whoever I can see is putting their hands up for saying to continue.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, you talked about pride. Now, pride has a lot of meanings, like you're proud of doing a good job.
Right.
Or certain pride you have, which is not really like arrogance, but pride. So do you think that is an obstruction? Basically, you have to remove your personality completely, right?
No, see, the point is, pride in doing something good gives somebody a motivation or a temporary satisfaction. But from a spiritual point of view, we are not doing anything for our own glory. See, there are only 2 aspects in the Christian theology. There are 2 aspects which are generally mentioned as the purpose of action. One is for the good of humanity.
Yeah.
One is for the good of humanity. So that is one aspect. The second aspect is, I'm talking from the Christian theology point of view. They say for the glory of God. What does it mean by glory of God? That means we are showing the presence of that divinity everywhere by revealing it to humanity. Our action should be such that we are revealing it to humanity, the divinity that is there in manifestation. That is how we by God, not by just doing bhajan or saying prayers to God or worship in a church or a temple. No, that is not the glory of God.
Yeah, but when you're talking about Christianity, they're talking about a Christian God.
No, forget about it. That's why I have not used the term God. I have used the term divinity.
Yes,
See, there is divinity in manifestation, isn't it?
absolutely.
So why should we bother about? I'm only picking up those words which are beautiful words
Yeah.
for the glory of God and to the perfection of humanity is a statement.
Uh-huh.
So for the glory of God means you are revealing the divine presence in manifestation through your actions.
Yes.
That is one
So
kind
you're
of
a
action.
conduit. You have no personality, and the God is through you. No
Yes.
pride, no arrogance. Right?
So you are doing only for these two purposes. So where is the question of pride? That is why I gave that statement which needs to be contemplated. I will repeat that statement, which
Yeah.
says pride only comes from ignorance.
Yeah.
Pride only comes from ignorance. That ignorance is what makes one think that I am doing it.
Yeah.
That I am the only one doing it. I am
Yeah.
doing it better than somebody. But
Right.
it has been proved now, especially in the 21st century, that cooperation is the only watchword. Competition is no longer a valid thing. Though some people may be still in that prehistoric mentality of competing, but competition has been completely wiped out from the 21st century point of view because it is only cooperation which achieves things.
That's Krishnamurti is saying anyway. Yeah.
No, there was so many. See, practically it is true. For example, I'll tell you a simple instance. See, we have this iPhone,
Yeah.
isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
This iPhone, thousands and thousands and thousands of people are working on the manufacture or actually building the iPhone.
Mm-hmm.
The beauty of it is no single individual or group of individuals has complete knowledge of the entire iPhone.
Mm-hmm. I didn't know that.
It is a fact. It is a fact with almost all kinds of technologies today.
Yeah.
Each one knows his part of it and he is just integrating it into it.
Mm-hmm.
So if I am working on a particular aspect of that particular iPhone, I am only aware of it and I don't know what my neighboring team is doing.
Mm-hmm.
This way, some hundreds and hundreds of teams are working and they have all put together this iPhone. But is there a single individual, including Tim Cook, who can claim that I know the iPhone end to end, everything about it, and I can deal with it? It's impossible.
Mm-hmm.
So where is the question of anybody feeling pride? The company as a whole may feel that Apple has produced a great iPhone.
Yeah.
But is there any possibility of an individual saying that I have achieved myself something great without the effort of other members of the team or without the effort of the whole company working for it?
Well,
So,
I don't know. They might have some pride. I don't know if it's arrogance,
no,
but
see that also is from ignorance only, madam. That is where one has to be brutally honest. One has to be brutally honest to oneself that there is no space for pride, even an iota of pride. Even an iota of pride, there is no place. And this is a fact. It is not that one is trying to act humble. No, it is not the achievement. No, it's the achievement of the group. It is not the my own individual. I'm not talking about that silly way of expressing things. That's another form of arrogance. The truth of the matter is that there is no scope for feeling an iota of pride in any of our actions because there are a million contributing factors which have helped you to do that act.
yeah.
That is what I am trying to bring about.
Yeah, and the same thing with karma, you cannot say karma and stop doing anything,
Karma is
including being
again,
a
as I
physician.
said, not individual alone.
Yeah,
Karma is not individual. Again, see, if I am the only person in the world, how will I exhaust my karma?
mhm.
If I am the only person concerned with myself and unrelated to anything, how can I exhaust my karma, or how can I perform any karma? So I
Yeah.
need people around. I need everything around me to perform that action. That
What
is
I
where,
mean is, yeah, if you're a physician, you can't say it's karma. You have to have some kind of pro-will-based actions.
yes, obviously.
Yes.
And that will has to be divinely invoked. I
Yes.
cannot foolishly call my own desires and my own passions as will.
Agree.
Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ignorance and innocence, we need to be careful while eliminating which one needs to be removed. Don't you think we need to be cautious? See, this is again the mind playing the game, madam. Sania ji, it is the mind which has created these two terms, ignorance and innocence.
It's Dr. Sana.
It is Dr. Sana. Okay, Dr. Sana, sorry. Dr. Sana, it is the mind which is playing these games. It calls one part ignorance and the other part innocence. See, the absence of ignorance is the presence of innocence. The total absence of ignorance. One cannot be simultaneously ignorant and innocent. The total absence of ignorance is innocence. That is the reason. That is the reason why it is said that there is a beautiful book. I forget it. I think it's called as the Light on the Path, or the Idyll of the White Lotus, or some book is there of the Theosophical Society, which says that you have to wash your feet in innocence before entering into the kingdom of heaven. You have to wash your feet in innocence. Very poetic and a beautiful way of putting it. You have to wash your feet in innocence before you can step into the kingdom of heaven. So you have to get rid of your ignorance totally, and the presence of the self, the presence of what you call as the I or the me or the mine, has to be completely eliminated. Then only you will be in a state of innocence, and then only one is fit to enter into the other, enter into that divine. It's not a place. Kingdom of heaven doesn't mean it's a place. It's a state of consciousness. It's a state of being. Let us not imagine that heaven is something up above there and then it has got all these features and all. They are all allegorical stories. They are all allegorical stories that there is a pearly gate and Saint Peter standing there. This is not physically there. It's a state of consciousness. Okay?
No, Krishna Padaji, I have a slight different perception as far as ignorance and innocence is concerned. I think I need to seek more clarification just for a minute or so. For me, eliminating ignorance leads to a kind of egoistic all-knowership, whereas innocence, still you maintain that margin where you have that urge to know, innocency. No, that urge to know, whereas total elimination of ignorance or ignorance may lead to aham bhava or some kind of a ego that I know, all knower.
So what you are
Whereas
saying
innocence
is,
keeps that margin always. You need to know.
if I understand you rightly, only an ignorant person will say that I know everything. An innocent person will always be in a state of mind which says that I have more to know, I have more to understand, I have more to realize. So that is the state of innocence. Whereas an ignorant fellow thinks that he knows everything and it's all very clear to him and things like that. So what you said is true in from that point of view.